Welcome to Discovering You, a podcast that explores the intricacies of personality and how it impacts the way we navigate through life. What will you discover today? Hi, listeners. Hi, Heather.
Hi there.
How are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you?
I am better now that I just had a little therapy session with you before we started recording.
Yeah, we talked for 1 hour before we hit the record button.
Yes, we did.
I'm curious if my mood meter would be different now than it was before, because I did it before we logged on.
You just read my mind. That's exactly what I was thinking. And I almost think it would be different. And I think that just speaks to the power of connection and friendship and all of that kind of great stuff.
Yeah, I agree.
Why I'm saying that is because today I am in the red zone. And so the word that I got is frustrated. And listeners, I'll read to you what it says for that. The way it defines it is upset because you cannot do something you want to do. It always makes me think when I read what the description of the word is, because I don't know that it's necessarily what I would think. But when I related it to the situation that I'm frustrated about, actually, there's a couple. So Heather and I were talking. One thing is sort of a family situation. The other thing is a work situation. And in both cases, probably I would like to be able to say or do something that for whatever reason I feel like I can't. Bingo. There's the frustration. Heather was very kind to be my therapist and we had a good back and forth. What about you? What did you come up with today, Heather?
I couldn't even figure out what color I was in. And then I ended up in the blue section. I landed on vulnerable, which was interesting. It's defined as feeling like you could easily be emotionally or mentally hurt. I don't typically get super emotional. Having someone to bounce it off of, even if it's not directly connected to you, having some perspective. Now that I've said it all out loud, I feel like maybe my mood is definitely different. I feel less vulnerable about situations I can't control. Power of a conversation.
That's amazing. And I think that's probably part of what the mood meter is all about. So going back to Mark Brackett and Dr. Robin Stern, who created it. And it's about going into your day mindfully. What am I feeling? Why do I think I'm feeling this way? And then listeners, if you haven't done it, and Heather and I don't necessarily talk about this part, but let's say you're in a less than ideal mood. There'll be little things that you can click on the app and it'll kind of give you some suggestions for what you can do, perhaps to move through that mood and some strategies. And actually, even if you get something that you're happy with, it'll also give you ways to maintain it. It's not just if it's a bad mood. There's that part of it too. I'll, as always, recommend checking it out. As you can see, it forms the whole introduction for our show and is quite helpful. I'm really excited to get into this episode, but first it's time for our disc analogy. This time, if disc was a board game, what would it be? High D is Monopoly. When you go on and you read the description of Monopoly, it says it's described as the ultimate game of capitalism. The goal is to drive your competitors into bankruptcy. I was like, wow, it's very interesting because, of course, when I read that, I'm like, I guess so. But that just shows that I don't have a super high D because that's not necessarily how I viewed it. High I is charades, of course. It's interactive, it's emotive, fun, high-spirited. High S is the game of life. So in this one, it rewards players for good behavior. For instance, if you are recycling or you're helping others, and this is very on brand for high S. And then high C is clue, and it's all about using deductive reasoning to solve a mystery. So that checks out for me. I love Clue. We went through a phase in our family where we were obsessed and played it all the time. Have you ever played it, Heather?
I think I played it when I was younger. I feel like every episode's the same. I'm like, I don't really do a board game. I've never played Monopoly.
No way.
I've never played Charades. I've never even heard of the game of life. Although I do think I've played Clue, Killed with the Candlestick.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right? Professor Plum in the billiard room with the revolver.
Where would Trivial Pursuit fall on this? That's a board game I've played.
Trivia, exactly. It's probably a combo between C and D. I love Trivial Pursuit. Because, I also could have done Scrabble and chess, but I kind of just wanted to keep them. Yeah, me too. Scrabble would totally be high C. Sophia said to me when I was telling her what the theme was going to be, she's like, oh, well, obviously like Scrabble is high C. And I was then torn. I was like, it is. But I was like, I love Clue so much and I have to put it in there. And it is high C because the whole thing is deductive reasoning. Like, oh, if that person called out that eliminates this. So it's really strategic. And you also have to be kind of private and secretive because you're looking at your cards. You don't really want to give stuff away.
Right.
The game of life is an old game. Like when I was looking at it just to see when it came out, I swear the first iteration was late 1800s.
Oh, wow.
And then it's evolved. So that whole recycling part of it, that came in the 90s. Yeah, they made an addition to it in the 90s. Monopoly, I don't know if it's listed as the most popular, but I think it's right up there. And what's interesting to me is Chris and Sophia love Monopoly. So if it's ever a time, I guess a little bit during the pandemic or when she was younger, or like around Christmas, oh, let's play a board game. They always want to play Monopoly, and I never want to play Monopoly.
Forever?
Yes. It doesn't seem like a lot of skill. You're just rolling the dice. And then I have no time for it.
Yeah.
And I have all the time for Clue. So there you go. There's everything about DISC. Before we jump into part 2 of my discussion with Michelle Minnikin, and if you missed the first part, she's an organizational psychologist, an executive coach, and author of the book, Girl Deprogramming. Heather and I did the quiz that she created to determine where we fall on the good girl scale. So the scale goes from highest, which would be the good girl range, to middle, which is a navigating woman, and then the lowest, which she's called the rebel woman. The areas with the highest scores are the ones we need to focus on. And in case this doesn't make sense, this will make a lot more sense when you listen to the second part where Michelle is talking all about her book. Heather and I are going to share our scores. We both scored in the mid-range, which means navigating women. And this suggests that we are in the process of navigating and questioning the good girl conditioning that may have influenced our lives. So while we fell into the same range, my score was higher, but that indicates that Heather is actually doing a better job at the deprogramming than me. I had 2 areas where I scored high, meaning I have work to do on these. And what they involved was focusing on perceived faults and responsibilities and societal expectations that can lead to burnout. Guilty as charged. I only got one where I got rebel, and I was happy that it was this one because the area was about the importance of support networks and genuine connections with each other, which if we were on Armchair Expert right now, we would say ding, ding, ding. Because that's exactly what we just talked about at the beginning of our episode, was about this connection and how we both feel better after having had that chance to do that with each other. Heather, you didn't get any good girl scores and you got 2 rebels. Your rebel scores that you got, so again, listeners, this is kind of in the ideal range. For you, it's trusting your instincts and importance of personal safety and having a sense of self-worth and not letting external judgments define you. Well done, Heather.
You dug deeper into all of this, but I was like, oh, I do feel like that's a challenge, but it's something that I want for myself, right? Like I'm working on.
Were you surprised by that? Or did you feel like, oh yeah, that makes sense?
I do feel like now standing up for what I believe in as far as like my worth, my value, and people don't have to like it, but I also don't have to tolerate them being in my business. I don't know if I'm surprised. I think that's what I'm working on.
No, I think it's great. And on those ones, I kind of got sort of in the middle range, which I guess means I'm aware and I'm working towards it, but definitely struggle more with the external judgments. That's definitely a big one for me, which annoys me because I should know better, right?
But I think you also care more about people. I could be wrong, but maybe you don't necessarily care about what they think about you, but you care about them more than I do.
I do. In fairness, okay, sure, I do.
I meant that as a compliment.
No, I totally know. I totally know you did. And you're right. You're right. Because I do. We can tie this into EQ. Like that's the whole me having sort of a exceedingly high, not helpful degree of empathy at times. But to clarify, I do also worry about the judgment of me because I have this particular little kink in whatever it is that I have this obsession with not wanting to be misunderstood. And You know how you say like sometimes your strengths are your challenges? If I didn't have this, I probably wouldn't be doing the work I'm doing.
Yeah.
In terms of facilitation, trying to say to one person, oh, actually, I don't think that's their intention. If you look at it this way. And so for me, it's hard if I am doing something and I think that somebody is misconstruing where it's coming from, what my motivations might be. I have to get better at just saying, you know what, Victoria, like you can't win them all. You cannot worry about what every single person thinks.
Interesting, though, when you say it that way, it's still you worrying about how they are misconstruing it, not worrying about if they like you or not. For me, judgments are around, am I smart? Am I likable? I am who I am. And that's kind of where I got to now. Again, back to my profile. I have D days and I have C days, and some days I'm this and some days I'm that. And that's challenging enough for me to navigate. And so I just have to kind of be that person now and be okay with it. But you're still, the external judgments aren't about they're judging you. It's that you want everybody to understand.
It is to a degree, but I think you're giving me a lot of grace and I appreciate it. And I do care about others, so I will definitely agree with you on that. But if I'm worried about what they're thinking about me, that is on me. That is me having a fear of what their judgment of me might be. Some people have their triggers. Like for some people, it's like, oh, maybe they don't think I'm smart. That particular one isn't a trigger for me. You can back me up on this as somebody who helps out with my social media and all of that. I have a big focus on, because I'm naturally a private person, I don't love all the social media stuff that I have to do to promote my business and this podcast. I doubt there's a time that I post something where I don't think, oh, people think, oh, here she goes again, or oh, she's so full of herself. Or,
that's so fascinating.
It is. And I have to really get better at it, as the score shows too. What would Michelle say if she was listening to this conversation right now? I wonder if part of this leads right into it. Let's jump back into my conversation with Michelle. The more that you have these valid tools, even though we all think we know ourselves, sometimes, don't you think this subjective way of looking at it and just saying that, I mean, in my mind, I'm like, yeah, I know that. But then to actually see it and look what we both circuitously maybe were drawn into, and now look what we're doing. I love that. What I'm curious to ask you about is, having done all this work and having come from the organization yourself, are there things looking back that you wish were present when you were there, or even going forward in terms of leaders? Is there some advice that you have that you think would benefit leaders, or not even necessarily leaders, even just people in the workforce? What's something that you've gleaned from all of this?
Oh, that's a big question.
It is a big question.
My brain went into about 1,000 different ways at the same time. So I'll talk about my current sort of research hypothesis at the moment.
Yeah, please.
What happens to women and girls who are performing at higher rates in education?
Okay.
And getting more degrees, there's more doctors coming out, female doctors are coming out more than the male doctors across all of the Western world, the global north. And what happens the second that these high-performing women and girls hit an organization? What is that? Why all of a sudden do we have epidemics of lack of confidence, imposter syndrome, not commercial enough, and not speaking up enough? What is that? So yes, that is what I'm researching at the moment.
Have you ever read The Confidence Code?
Yes.
And I believe that's what they were looking at. The men were sort of focused on what they were saying. They weren't hard on themselves, whereas the women were very hard on themselves. I don't know if this is something that you're also focused on, or you've written a book called Girl Deprogramming. Tell us a little bit about what inspired that and what some of the big takeaways are from that book.
What happened was, when I got my ADHD diagnosis, I fell into this dark grief/rage about what my life could have looked like if I'd known this information sooner. I've had that conversation with many of us. And hilariously, rage, anger, is not a socially acceptable emotion for women, turns out.
Shocker.
Because I was feeling lots of anger, I went to get myself some coaching and therapy to sort of work my way through that, because it wasn't a pleasant place to live in. As a part of that, I was doing a sort of facilitator training course with a lady called Tara Moore, who wrote an awesome book called Playing Big. And she just mentioned the words good girl conditioning just offhand. It's in a book that I'd read a number of times and I'd glossed over it. It hadn't gone in. But she just, on a coaching call, she was coaching another lady and just said 3 words, good girl conditioning. And I was like, is that it? Because I could, at that point, I was able to understand what me was, what ADHD was, but there was also this huge blob of people pleasing, perfectionism, worried about what other people would think, and conflict avoidance, not being able to say no, not having any boundaries.
Oh, yes.
All of that. And I was like, that's what it is. It's good girl conditioning. And like very good psychologist, I had to find out how this happened. I went down the route of, well, obviously, we're all conditioned. We're all in a cult. We're in the cult of patriarchy. This is what it is. And we're conditioned. So how do people deprogram from cults?
Wow.
So it happened to lead me down a winding path to find a chap in America who, in the 1950s, was asked by the US military to try and find out why so many prisoners of war in the Korean War were defecting to China. So the American military powers that be thought that the Chinese had a magical brainwashing machine.
Oh.
So Albert Biderman and his team were tasked to try and figure out what that was. And he came up with a chart of coercion. So various coercive control tools that got the prisoners of war to behave and to convert. I saw this, I was like, oh, this is interesting. This is very interesting. And that sort of curiosity, which drives a lot of ADHDers, it's like, oh, I wonder if, which is also one of those questions that most ADHDers can go along with. I wonder if this explains how we are conditioned, how we are trained to behave under patriarchy. And within half an hour, I'd scribbled all over this piece of paper that I'd printed off the internet. And I went from this curiosity to absolute devastation because it totally fit. My hypothesis, my book is based on the premise that we are controlled, we are systematically coerced from birth to behave in a gender stereotypical way. I gave a talk on it and it went down really well. And so then I wrote the book because the idea just wouldn't go away. And the book is hard hitting, but it's also hilarious.
Well, I'm not surprised by interacting with you, Michelle. I can see that everything you would do would have humor infused.
Yeah, you have to laugh or you will cry. But yes, it's very hard hitting.
I think sometimes people, especially men, so for our male listeners, sometimes would feel sensitive or defensive about hearing the term patriarchy. And I was listening to a really interesting program about how reframing that and just the patriarchy isn't actually serving men either.
No.
Right? If you could speak to that and you can tell me what the reception has been to the book, or if you have a little bit of backlash from men or people saying, oh, this is men bashing. And when you really look at it, it's not serving men because men are conditioned in a certain way that they're not aware of either, right? So could you speak a little bit to that?
Oh, absolutely. So I was absolutely 1,000% prepared for a massive backlash. And actually, what has happened, men have been picking up my book. Men have been reading it. And I got this amazing review from a guy, I think he's in Australia. And he said it was like one of the only books I've read on the patriarchy, on these topics, that don't actually center the men. It's not about the men. We're mostly conditioned by the women in our lives and
yes,
ourselves. And men are absolutely harmed under patriarchy. I've got a lovely friend who lives in the US, and I've just recorded a podcast with him for my podcast. He wrote a book called The Secret Struggle. So it's a chap called Don Ryan, and it's all about suicide, male suicide, and the male suicide rates, because he's lost, sadly, 3 members of his family to suicide. And we have the same speaking coach, and that's how we met. And we realize really quickly that we are talking about exactly the same thing from a different angle.
Wow. One of the things, and again, I am absolutely not an expert on this, but just how women, we have this ability to connect with each other, to be vulnerable, to share. There's always the memes of girlfriends getting together, like drinking wine, having girls' night, but, laughing, crying, sharing. Whereas men haven't necessarily been conditioned to do that. And if they go out with their friends, a girl goes out with her friends and everything, right? You know what's going on with her daughter at school and about that person at work. And men go out with their friends and maybe they're golfing and you say, how's your friend doing? They just had a new baby. Oh, I don't know. And it's like, you don't know? What? And maybe he doesn't even remember. And then you're like, what did you talk about? We talked about the course and the weather and right. I think that's sort of even inherent. If they don't have that, they don't have that outlet. They don't have permission to be vulnerable and being able to do that. That's not serving them either.
No, it's not at all. And it's scary, actually, how men are harmed under the patriarchy, because then you have these men that come to the fore without naming any names who are, these big personalities that get people to follow them.
Yeah.
They are spouting all sorts of nonsense that is harmful to men and women. It's a worry.
100%.
Yeah, we are worried about that. But no, men have loved it, which is lovely.
That's amazing. I love to hear that. Just want to give the opportunity. I know that in your book, and I actually don't think you have to even get the book to do it, but I believe you have a quiz. Ladies, if you're listening and you want to kind of be like, this is maybe resonating with me a little bit. Maybe, I do have that good girl conditioning. Michelle, you want to tell us about the quiz that you created that you can take to discover if you are or not?
One of the tools of coercion is keeping women tired, which incidentally was the chapter of the book that took me the longest to write because I was so tired at that point.
There's irony.
Yeah. So it took me 6 months to write that one chapter, probably because there was a lot of avoidance and emotional eating involved because of all of the ways we're kept tired. And I wrote a long book. So it's 84,000 words. So it's a long book. And we don't have time to read that book. We don't have time amongst all of our extra jobs and our caring responsibilities for, the neighbours, the parents, the children, the nieces, the nephews, the cats, everything. And so I was like, right, what I need to do is create a quiz so it can direct women to read that chapter of the book that they need to read and they don't have to read the whole thing. So that's what I did.
Oh, that's really clever.
Being a psychologist, it does have 72 items in it, so 72 questions. But I think even doing the questions and reflecting, and I was really mean because I didn't give anyone the opportunity to sit on the fence. So you have to agree or disagree. Go through that. It's goodgirlquiz.co.uk.
And the name of your book is Good Girl Deprogramming. It's available, I think, in all formats, audio as well as,
Yeah. So yes, I recorded the audio myself, which was unbelievably tiring, turns out.
I imagine it would be. It's you know what you're reading. So you're not just reading words. It's evoking your research. It's evoking your life, your emotions. So I can imagine that would be very hard. But I think it's great that it is your voice so that people then will get a sense of you. And like I said, your enthusiasm and your spirit really come through when you made the joke about laughing your way through things. And I'm like, I can totally see that in you. And I can see why you are able to inspire so many people. So thank you so much for having this conversation with me. It was an absolute pleasure to chat with you, Michelle. I would love to have you back sometime.
Awesome. And I'd love you to come on to the Good Girl Deprogramming podcast too. I'd love to have you on that.
I would love to. Thank you.
Awesome.
I had a really great time chatting with Michelle. If you're interested and you would like to access the quiz for yourself and even her book, we're putting the info in the show notes. Well, that's all for today. Thanks for joining us. Catch you next time.
If you're interested in connecting with Victoria for team building, strategic onboarding, coaching, or a speaking engagement, you can contact her at discoverwhatworks@gmail.com.
This show is a Twisted Spur media production produced by our very own Heather McPherson. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share with a friend and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.